I'm Se Min, and I am a composer and sound designer. I write music for film, for theatre, and any other interactive mediums.
To me, sounds are more than just what you hear. They are snapshots that can transport you to a time, a place, or even an emotion.
Because people attach memories to a lot of sounds. I discovered how much sounds can do. So, in a recent visit to my aunt's place, she showed me a box of old photographs. These are my paternal grandparents. I've never seen my grandma or my grandpa so young before. These photographs, they don't show their environment, their day-to-day life. So what really got me interested is to find out what were the sounds that they heard.
And if I could recreate the sounds from a day in their lives in the era that these photographs were taken.
I actually don't know much about my paternal grandparents because my granddad passed away when I was 4.
My grandma, I saw her almost weekly, but never really got to know her. As a kid, I would greet her,
阿嬷你好,
and then run off to play with my cousins. My grandma spoke mostly in Hokkien and I barely understood it. So I grew up never really chatting with her until she passed away in my teens.
So these photos from my aunt's place, she had no idea how or when these were taken because she wasn't even born yet. But on the back of my grandfather's photograph, there is a date. So the 18th of March, 1949. And this appears to be his signature as well. They must have been around my age when they took these photographs. What I know is that around their 20s, they traveled from different countries and started a new life in Singapore.
To recreate the soundscape of their new daily lives in Singapore,
I would need to know where they lived, what the environment was like, what were the activities that happened. Then I would be able to know what sounds there were.
to get those answers, I turned to my #1 source for family history, my dad.
So I found these 2 photos from Kuku's place.
I remember them. I saw them when Daddy was very young.
And my daddy believes these photos were taken when they were newlyweds.
It's interesting how your Gong Gong and your Amma first met. Actually, your Amma came from Malaysia. This place called Pulau Ketam.
Where?
You know?
Where is
Yeah, Pulau Ketam is a small island outside Port Klang.
Then my dad points out my grandpa's hometown in Sumatra, just across the straits from where my grandma lived in Malaysia. I learned that long, long ago, my grandpa's father moved to Pulau Ketam to work for my grandma's father. The 2 fathers became friends. In fact, they became such good friends that they arranged for my grandparents to marry each other. And so my grandparents got married, and they decided to settle down in Singapore.
So do you have photos of when they first moved over?
This is among the earliest photo of your Amma standing at the courtyard of the Market Drive house. It's a ground floor terrace house.
So was Margaret Drive the first house they lived in when they moved to Singapore?
No, actually, Market Drive is where your daddy was born in 1960. When Gong Gong and Amma first came, that was 1950. So there was a long 10 years. But from what Amma told me, when they first came, they rented a room in this tofu jie.
So what does tofu jie mean?
My dad explains that tofu jie is tofu street in English. I have no idea where that is.
From a map, tofu jie is actually within the Chinatown. I don't know exactly where's the location, but it's around there.
So I'm really curious about my grandparents' first home. They live on Tofu Street, but there are no photos of it.
I need to find out how living on Tofu Street in the 50s was like for my grandparents.
Then I can recreate a soundscape of their lived experience.
So I head to the Chinatown Heritage Centre for a visit with the walking encyclopedia of local history, Dr. Lai.
I couldn't find Tofu Street on the map, so I was wondering if you knew where Tofu Street was.
Tofu Street is the name that was given by the local residents to Chinchu Street.
The street was supposedly named after tofu sellers who used to ply it. But Dr. Lai says there's no conclusive proof.
So here in this old map, you can see this is Chinchu Street connecting Southbridge Road to China Street, but it's been expunged and part of it is now China Square.
So what would the typical living arrangements be like on Chinchu Street?
The most common form of dwelling is the shop house. Let me show you a cubicle layout. You will see that there's these cubicles. These cubicles are about 2-point-something meters to 3-point-something meters, so
It's
they're actually
a
very
tiny
cramped.
space, yeah.
And these tiny cubicles were the rented rooms people lived in above the shops.
In fact, I can show you what the spaces look like.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I happily follow Dr. Lai as he gives me a tour of a typical subdivided shop house and points out the quintessential features. Like the shared kitchen, right next to the shared toilets. The central air well that allowed light into cramped quarters and also rain. The small windowless cubicles that even large families would have squeezed into. And the slats in between that were important for ventilation, but also aired everyone's conversations.
And then as you come over here, this is the most expensive cubicle because it's right next to the road, right? There's a lot of light.
So why was the living arrangement so cramped?
Well, it was cramped mainly because Singapore attracted a lot of Chinese immigrants to look for a better life.
And new immigrants contributed to the local Chinese population boom. By the 1950s, there were over 1 million Chinese here, almost 10 times their population in the 1890s. Singapore, under British governance then, had a town plan that assigned ethnic groups to different enclaves. And so new Chinese arrivals had no choice but to squeeze into the already crowded Chinatown.
So in the 1950s, your grandparents would have been living in such conditions. You can imagine those were very frugal times, and most of the people who lived here were not rich.
While walking through the hallways, it opened my eyes to how my grandparents could have lived in such a space. Now I need to find out what they actually did on a day-to-day basis to build my soundscape, because sound denotes activity. I don't even know what their occupations were.
I am a sound artist, and I want to recreate the soundscape of a day in the life of my grandparents when he first moved to Singapore in the 1950s. I now know where they lived and their living conditions, but I'm clueless about what they got up to there. I don't even know what they did for a living. So naturally, I turned to my dad again to find out.
So this is the 2016 map, and it's blocked by a building now.
Okay. So it's called Chinchu.
Yeah. Do you know what they did on a day-to-day basis?
Actually, Gong Gong was a teacher at a very small school.
The school, my dad says, was in another neighborhood, but he doesn't know much more about it.
Amma was a housewife, busy with the house and the children.
I find out that 3 of my elder aunties and uncles grew up in a tiny cubicle on Chinchu Street.
That was before my time, so I don't know what else they do.
I learned from my dad that my grandfather, he was a teacher, and my grandma, she was a housewife. So that meant that she took care of 3 children. She probably did the groceries and all the daily necessities.
I can now imagine a possible daily routine they could have had, starting with my grandfather going to work and my grandma doing the marketing. But I don't know how they would have gotten around in the mornings, and more importantly, what that commute would have sounded like. So I head to Chinatown for a chat with a former resident.
With my 20 years of living in Chinatown, I'm producing a book.
Uncle Chan had lived in Chinatown from the 1940s to the 60s, though not on Chinchu Street. He remembers that period vividly, as can be seen in his beautiful sketches of his memories.
could you tell me how my grandparents might have traveled from Chin Chu Street?
Well, Chinju Street was a small residential street. There is no public transport.
For his commute to work, my granddad would have had to walk to the larger roads further out to take public transport.
Public transport would be the bus and the trolley bus.
What were trolley buses?
The trolley bus, it has got two antennas that connect to the overhead cables. Now, this is driven by electricity. You can hear the motor sound.
Oh.
Then start.
Could I record you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then it stop, you know?
Trolley buses were apparently not the most reliable mode of transport. Uncle Chan describes how the bus would jerk to a stop whenever the antenna got loose. And the poor bus conductor would have to climb up to fix it. And the bus moved so slowly that Uncle Chan could hop on, hang on from the steps, and get a free ride.
So which of these modes of transportation would pass through Chin Chu Street?
Trishaws. This is a trishaw with the pedal on the side. Trishaws go from the narrower street. This is usually used by housewives for marketing and all that.
So my grandma might have used the trishaw.
Yes, yes, yes.
After chatting with Uncle Chan, I walk over to where I now know Chin Chu Street used to be.
So I learned from Uncle Chan that Chin Chu Street was a residential street and there was a lot more walking and just trishaws on it.
It sounds like it was a quiet street based on Uncle Chan's description. So different from how it is today.
It faces a major road and there's now a lot of vehicle sounds and even the air vents blasting out just below the buildings.
I still need help to imagine how Chin Chu Street might have sounded like in the 50s. And since a great source of sounds are objects from that time, I meet Art Director Junior, who's the go-to guy when it comes to creating period sets for film and TV.
I'm trying to recreate the soundscape of my grandparents' lived experience of Chin Chu Street in the 50s. Would you have any period objects?
Oh, yes. As you can see, I have a lot of period pieces. A lot of my research work used references like photos from National Archives Singapore. What we have here is two photos of Chin Chu Street.
It actually looks quiet.
Yeah, it does, and there isn't any like vendors along the pathways. Oh, and I have one of the record interview from a former resident of Chin Chu Street. So let's hear it.
Chin Chu Street, is actually a very quiet street, and we are predominantly Hokkien. The neighbors, they are shopkeepers. For example, my neighbor was a sort of a scrap, collectors. They collect scrap metals and all that, sort it out and pack it, and then they will sell it. And there were sort of Chinese medicine shop, wooden case producer. So all sort of small little, shops. And at night, nobody operates any business after 5 o'clock.
So it seemed like they were only small shops.
Correct. If you're trying to recreate sounds from the medicine shop, one of the things that you can hear is very obvious sound. It's abacus. It really brings you back past because you don't hear sounds like this anymore. Maybe you can add in a little bit of detail sound. So when they have a paper and then they grab the herbs.
Oh, okay, like packaging paper.
Yeah, like packaging paper.
Junior enthusiastically suggests more objects I can use to make sounds from the other shops described, like the scrap metal shop.
It sounds like there's no market on the street, so where might my grandmother have gone to for her groceries?
There's actually a neighboring street, Upper Chin Chu Street, where there's a street market. So you see, it's actually very busy street as compared to the previous Chin Chu Street.
Yeah, it all spilled out on the road.
So I think to recreate the sounds from this street, the most common thing you see in this reference photo is the wave of the baskets. I have here with me.
Okay, this is huge.
So in the past, when they had their do their market, we can use sounds like this. You can get two, and then you can like knock them together.
So like an archaeologist using uncovered artifacts to piece together details of an ancient civilization, I used the different objects from Junior's treasure trove to bring the sounds from my grandparents' past back to life.
The meeting has challenged me even more because Chin Chew Street is quiet. What else could have been happening? So I recorded a lot more everyday sounds. When I found out that Chin Chew Street was a quiet street, I smiled to myself inside because I thought of my grandparents coming back to this little enclave after a long day. I think they might have chosen it. Yeah, chosen the peace and quiet.
As a sound designer, I know that silence has different meanings and qualities. I wonder how their quiet evenings would have sounded like in the 1950s. I'm a composer, and I'm trying to recreate the sounds experienced by my grandparents in their first home in Singapore on Chin Chew Street in the 50s. I roughly know how it sounded like in the day, but I'm clueless about their evenings and nights. So I meet Marcus, who studies the art of entertainment and can give me a sense of what they would have done for fun after a long day.
So Marcus, I'm really curious to know how my grandparents might have spent their leisure time in Singapore in the 50s.
If you're talking about home entertainment, obviously radio and rediffusion were the prime choices. This is the classic rediffusion set.
Rediffusion, Marcus explains, used cable to transmit its programs instead of radio waves, which at the time required you to own a costly radio set.
Compared to a radio, which you have to buy it, right? And then there's a radio licensing fee. For the rediffusion set, it was just $5 for a rental of this set per month.
The easy-to-use set only had two knobs, one for the volume and the other for the channel.
Rediffusion had two main channels, the gold channel and you have the silver channel. The silver channel were all the English programs. Here we have a program list from the newspapers in 1958. There's a little section for rediffusion, right? And it lists down all the different programs, right, at different times.
The gold channel offered programs in the different dialects: Hokkien, Cantonese, Teochew, and Hakka, which Marcus points out were the main Chinese languages spoken during the 50s.
Your grandparents may have heard the kind of radio plays that were common then. So I have an example of a radio play here in Hokkien. And let's have a listen.
I tried to make sense of it with the measly Hokkien words I know.
Sounds like a lover's squabble.
I didn't understand most of it, but yeah, it was very expressive.
Yeah, my Hokkien is a bit rusty too, but oh well.
Such drama started out live on the streets, performed by storytellers and Chinese opera troupes. These public performances attracted people by the throngs. But by the 50s, their popularity had waned, and rediffusion and other radio services eventually took their place.
So it was really considered the people's medium of entertainment then, because rediffusion had a range of different kinds of programs. So interestingly, it became a medium for which people with different backgrounds came together.
Marcus explains that in shared living spaces like the shop house my grandparents lived in, people would gather around the rediffusion set, especially since not everyone could afford the $5 rental fee. For some, their days revolved around their favorite programs, but that also caused squabbles over which channel to tune into.
Before rediffusion or radio, the kinds of entertainment that you have were primarily live entertainment. So here you have a kind of a changing social scape in that sense.
All through listening.
Yes, ultrasound.
I'm surprised to learn actually that red diffusion and radio were two different things. And I can understand why my grandparents would gravitate towards red diffusion because they spoke in dialect, in Hokkien, after a hard day of work. Coming together and then listening to a language that's so close to your heart would be really comforting. Yeah. I now have everything I need to recreate my grandparents' acoustic experience on Chin Chew Street. I record a few more sounds before layering and mixing all of them for the final soundscape.
I didn't have much memory of my grandparents, but this journey allowed me to step into their shoes and be part of their lives in old Singapore. So this final soundscape is what my grandma, as a housewife, and my granddad, who was a teacher, would have heard if both of their lives were welded together in the same moment. So I begin from being in the shop house with the bowls and the chopsticks clanging. I'm imagining breakfast. And then I would also reveal sounds on Chin Chew Street in the 50s, sounds of metal scraps, the abacus counting. And then I would move into Upper Chin Chew Street where the market was. And then, of course, sounds from rediffusion, which my grandma and my grandpa might have heard together as they enjoy the evening. I don't have recordings of my grandparents' voices, but the closest I can get to is to recreate the soundscapes they would have heard. I've never created something as personal as this, so to be listening to this soundscape is like being with them in that time.
I share with you.